Greetings, friends. Welcome to Training Café, where we commune together with coffee and our neighbor's dog that you might hear barking. Yes, I'm here on my back deck. It's a beautiful day in Pennsylvania, and I'm doing what I've been doing for the last 10 weeks, which is hanging out at home, sipping coffee with my friends, and talking training for climbing, because, of course, coffee makes everything better. Climbing, training, talking about climbing training. So today I want to talk a little bit about discipline and commitment and what role that plays in performance and your long-term arc as a climber. And then I'll get to some of your questions, which I see a handful of questions have been typed in here the last few minutes. You know, enthusiastic climbers tend to be really disciplined, focused people. And, climbing's a sport that demands a lot of focus, both in terms of being aware of risk and risk management. You need to, just as a motorcyclist needs to kind of have their head on a swivel and know what's going on around them, because there's a lot of crazy people on the roads that might run them over. In climbing, you need to kind of, in a different way, have your head on a swivel, being aware of how risk when you're on a climbing wall, whether it's indoors or outside, how the different factors that come into play, fall potential, objects you could hit, so on and so forth. Weather, of course, if you're up on a bigger climb, becomes a factor, so on and so forth. But also when it comes to training for climbing and kind of putting together a program of training for climbing over the long term, you need to have a system, which I've talked about extensively before. It's not enough to set a goal and just kind of make it up as you go. That's not an effective way to getting to your climbing goals, but you need a system that, of course, evolves and gets tweaked as needed based on feedback, based on results. And, kind of staying on course towards your goals and, making some changes as obstacles pop up, injuries occur, quarantines occur, things that are unexpected that throw a monkey wrench into the system. And sometimes for really enthusiastic climbers, obsessive climbers, it's themselves that can become the biggest enemy. And so that's where discipline and commitment needs to be to a healthy extent. And if you become obsessive over the long term with climbing, it becomes a prescription for injury and burnout, and suddenly being involved in a sport that you don't even enjoy that much anymore. And I've seen a lot of people fall by the wayside and quit climbing, because of that. They kind of went in all, to the point of, or at the expense of everything else in their life. Climbed 7 days a week, trained obsessively, got injured, got burned out. All of a sudden their improvement stopped, and, climbing just wasn't fun for them anymore. And, I'm a climber of 43 years, perhaps for more than any other reason, I've made it this long because I've never been that full-time, over-the-top climber where it's just all I've done. I started climbing in high school. I was a student in college, and I was a climber, climbing at a high level. And then out of college, I always had a job. And I would go on long trips, and, my various jobs and my career have allowed me to take extended trips throughout the year at times. But also, much of the year I would be at home with my family and working a job and pulling a paycheck. So there's always a sense of balance. And, when you strike that balance, it might not be the best for optimizing your gains and realizing your potential. Certainly if at some point I would have, just climbed full time for a couple of years, maybe I would have been a better climber. I would suspect so. But I might not be still climbing today in my 50s and enjoying climbing because of, not having some balance in my life. And so I think that's something each of us kind of has to feel out as we progress through our careers. What is that healthy level of commitment? And, we can't all become 5'14" or 5'15" climbers. Genetics do play a factor, but climbing is a sport where there are so many facets to climbing performance, so many things that influence climbing performance. It's a very technical sport. So people who can refine technique year over year for many years will continue to get better, even if genetically they're not meant to be the strongest climber in the world. Climbing at a high level demands cognitive abilities and refining mental skills year over year. And of course, it requires strength and power and endurance, which we can all develop to a higher level. But, not all of us are going to do one-arm pull-ups. Not all of us are going to do one-arm, one-finger pull-ups. There are genetic constraints to climbing, just as there are to, playing in the NBA or becoming a Olympic sprinter or runner or being the best in any sport. Most any sport, there are genetic predispositions that play a role. But I think someone with average genetic makeup, like myself, can climb at a pretty high level, get into the 5'13", the 8A range, for sure. I think with many years of disciplined effort and training and refining technique and the mental game and strength development, you can get there at the very least. And if you have some genetic predisposition to strong tendons, power, strength, well, then maybe you will be a 5'15" climber someday. You don't know unless you try. That's the bottom line. And so while that genetic talent is important, there's a popular saying here in the United States I've heard amongst coaches in a variety of sports, is that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. So we all know, or if you've been around long enough, you've met a climber who just is blessed genetically with really strong fingers. They have that genetic gift, that God-given gift to climb at a super high level. Strong tendons, strong fingers, natural power, Chris Sharma-like strength. But yet they don't become Chris Sharma because they haven't given enough to the sport. They haven't given up enough things outside of the sport. If you just dabble in climbing, if you just go half in, just dip your toe in the water, you won't realize that talent that you have. And so the person with just average talent who does develop a system and a plan and goes all in within reason, healthy commitment, they will realize their potential and perhaps end up climbing harder than that climber that has genetically the potential to be ridiculously strong and powerful. And so remind yourself of that. Hard work beats talent quite often, especially when talent doesn't work hard. So you think of discipline, self-discipline as a great equalizer. And that's not just discipline in going to the gym and following through with your workout plan, but it's discipline on the foods you consume, eating a proper diet to, help you recover from your workouts and gain strength and avoid injury. Discipline on not eating a lot of junk foods, things that can separate you from your goals, because we are in a strength to weight ratio sport. This is not a sport where you can eat anything you want. If you want to be in a sport where you can, well, then become a marathon runner or become an American football player or a soccer player where you burn a fantastic number of calories every day doing those sports. You can eat pretty much whatever you want, I suppose. But climbing's not that way. Climbing doesn't burn that many calories. You'd be surprised how few calories a gym workout burns. And so we do have to count our calories to some degree. Again, not obsessively, but eating healthful diet, getting enough protein, enough carbs, and enough healthy fats each and every day. And then kind of optimizing our body weight. Discipline on getting a good night's sleep for recovery. Sleep is hugely important for recovery and for keeping your immune system up, and just avoiding things in your life that can pull you away from climbing, pull you away from reaching your goals, because it does take a lot of discipline to climb at a high level. Once your technique and mental game and strength have been built to a real high level, that's not enough. You still need to put the puzzle pieces, the nuance together, to climb your hardest ever route. It's one thing to climb that route bolt to bolt, and it's another thing to put it together and clip the anchors, or to send your hardest ever boulder. And that's where it takes focus and discipline to get everything right. And so I guess just kind of to wrap things up, let me just kind of throw at you the 3 levels of commitment as I see it. And the lowest level of commitment, I guess, is kind of that person who's a dreamer. They're always talking about the hardest ever climb they're going to do, or the big wall, or the trip they're going to take, or the training program they're going to dive in on this winter, but they never follow through. So they're good at talking about goals and talking about plans, and they occasionally go climbing, and they occasionally go to the gym and train, but it's not consistent. And when it comes to physical training or just developing skill, climbing is a skill sport. You have to do it frequently, over the long term, to develop the skill. So that lowest level of commitment is kind of the dreamer, the talker, but not so much the doer or the person that follows through. Next up is the big middle area, where your commitment is healthy. You are all in on training. You're putting in your 4 days a week. You're putting in your couple of climbing sessions or more per week, but you're also taking some days off. You're not tempting injury by doing too much, training too hard. You haven't become so obsessive that you train till you drop. You take frequent rest days or deload weeks. You have balance in your life. Maybe you're in school or have a job that you balance with your commitment to training. You might work 40 hours a week and train 20 hours a week, and then climb outside on weekends. Having that balance, always keeps you motivated to get out and climb. That's the mode I've been in all these years. And what's interesting is, when I'm kind of at work, I'm dreaming about the climb that I'm going to do that weekend, or the workout I'm going to do in the evening. And then when I go on a longer trip for a month or two, I get the payoff. And what's interesting is, by the last week or so of the trip, I'm actually looking forward to getting back to my old schedule, getting back to work, getting back to my family. And that's a nice, healthy back and forth balance. A lot of sports have seasons, but climbing really doesn't necessarily have a season. You can do it year round. And so you need to have a way to kind of have a natural cycle throughout the year between, training mode and performance mode, and having, weaving in and out with that other things that are important in your life that give you that balance. And then the highest level commitment, or let's say overcommitment, is, that obsessed climber who that's all they think about. It's all they do, from waking up to falling to sleep. And, a lot of us are that way. I mean, I don't go very long during the day without thinking about climbing in some way, because it's a big part of my job and my family, my kids, my wife. I mean, we, have a lot of climbing involved. I walk through my house and there's campus boards and ropes hanging around, and I walk into the basement and there's bouldering walls and tread walls. And so, yeah, I'm going to think about climbing a lot, but I'm involved in other things. It just hasn't become all I think about. I guess, you are in that level of overcommitment when it starts to negatively affect your relationships, or you can't, get traction in a job or in school. You are, so into climbing, but so detached from everything else, maybe even your family. And I don't think that's healthy, because there's nothing more important than family when it's all said and done. Other signs of that unhealthy commitment is chronic injury, from overtraining and just climbing too much. Climbers that are chronically injured often fall into this class. Though, some people are genetically predisposed to being injured, and past sports injuries can recur, and so injury isn't a definitive sign of overcommitment. But if you are frequently injured or burned out, or if you suffer from depression, all of those things may involve a commitment to climbing that is just too much, and just, I guess, ultimately ends up weighing you down. And those are the people that may end up burning out on the sport, which is sad, because climbing is such a great life sport. It can be something that you're involved in from your teenage years into your senior years. And you can have a long period, from age 15 to age, 60 or higher, that you can climb at a high level. And there's few sports like that. It's a sport you can travel the world, travel the country, and see and meet people around the world. That's one of the most wonderful things, and do with your family, as I have over the years with my wife and kids. And so I guess I'll wrap things up there. Hopefully, especially to the newer climbers, only in their first few years in this sport, this is something to think about and to be aware of as you find your way in this sport. Okay, so let's shift gears and we'll move on to answering some questions here. Oh, and by the way, the shout out, the Training Cafe shout out for today, and this is a big one. French climber Melissa Le Neve, I believe is how you say her name, sent Action Directe yesterday. I believe it would have happened on Wednesday. I saw it on Instagram this morning. I've only briefly met her once in Seus in passing, but of course I've known of her. She's one of the top French climbers, one of the top female climbers in the world, and she's climbed in the Frankenmuir quite a bit in recent years. She did Wolfgang Gulick's Wall Street, which is 14B, a few years ago, and I knew from mutual friends that she had been to Germany a few times working Action Directe, which of course was the world's first 9A, 514D. It's a short, powerful, very steep route. When you climb it, when you redpoint it, you literally do the route in 2 minutes. It's just pure power endurance on small pockets. And hence, it's not the type of route that maybe the typical female climber would even want to get on. But if you're a strong, powerful boulderer, or sport climber like she is, then, why not give it a try? And she has been giving it a try. And I guess yesterday was the day that she ticked it off. And so the first female ascent, as far as I know, of Action Directe. And I mean, it's only had maybe 20 or 25 ascents in the 30 years since Wolfgang put the route up. And so it is perhaps the most famous sport climb in the world. And it's a big one to tick. And I've stood under it a few times. Not that I've ever been on it. I'm not. That's not my grade, that's for sure. But it's an amazing historic line. And I'm hoping that someday I'm going to belay one or two people on that I know up close and personal. So that's a story yet to be written. Okay, so let me see if I can, I'm outside here with glare in my computer screen, see if I can see a few of your questions here. We got about 10 minutes left, so I'll see if I can blow through a few of these. Let me scroll back up. Liam is asking about doing a hangboard session on the same day that you do a climbing session. Yeah, there's a few different ways to do this, and I often do this. If you have access to a climbing gym or a bouldering wall and a hangboard, you can do them all on the same day. I mean, you should try to, keep the energy systems focused. So if you're doing a strength power day in the gym where you're doing hard bouldering, limit bouldering, some campusing, that would be the day you'd also want to do a little bit of hangboarding, some max hangs type hangboarding. And depending on your schedule, you could split them up and do, say, a hangboard session in the morning, and then 6 hours later do a bouldering session. You do want to have them separated, have a meal in between, maybe have a nap in between. And, again, that separation of 6 or 8 hours is more beneficial. That's more of an elite climber's strategy. If you're going to do it all in one session, well, then what you want to do is a very comprehensive warm-up that kind of takes you into your limit bouldering, but then stop about halfway through your limit bouldering before you get too fatigued, and then go do some of your, a few sets of your max hangs, and then maybe do a few more boulders at the end. Or, if you're going to maybe dovetail a little bit of campus training in that same session. The key is not to get too fatigued with your limit bouldering and your campusing so that you can't be effective in really doing your max hang training in that same session. Now, if you're doing repeaters for strength endurance on a hangboard, well then, you could throw that in at the end of a 4x4 bouldering session, or even some roped climbing. You could go do some repeaters, which is training more that strength endurance, that anaerobic lactic energy system, and even the aerobic system to some degree. And so that you could do at the end of a more fatiguing climbing session. So, this gets to the sticky, complicated subject of exercise prescription and program design. And there's a lot of nuance there that depends on you, the climber, your training history, how strong you are to get it just right. But, there's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's certainly more than one way to kind of work these programs together. I see here multiple messages here, someone commenting about, traveling to climb here with this ongoing COVID crisis. And yeah, that is a complicated topic, and I think we're all going to have a little different opinions on when is the right time to start climbing. Here in Pennsylvania, now I'm luckily not in Philadelphia, which is where the worst of the problems are in Pennsylvania, but things have been improving, though parts of Pennsylvania are still on in lockdown mode, though much of the country is reopening. And in the Western states, with proper social distance and a mask, things have opened back up. Out in the Rocky Mountain states, I have talked to many of my friends and in the front range of Colorado, and people are out climbing, and they're trying to keep their distance and not congregate at the crags in crowds, but to go bouldering as a pair. I mean, if there's two of you in the car together, what's the difference between the two of you being out bouldering together? Now, certainly you don't want to be in large groups, and you don't want to go to crowded crags, because that wouldn't be the appropriate thing just yet. Here in the East, I don't know that we're ready to be outside at the crags yet, though I know some people going up in the rural hills and remote areas, and I suppose that's probably not problematic. But the climbing gyms are still closed, of course, and the more urban crags, around the mid-Atlantic and northeastern U.S., as far as I know, are still mostly closed, though I hear the Red River Gorge will begin to open back up, perhaps as early as this weekend. And so each of us has to make our own decision on what is the right thing for us. Again, this continues to be a disease of mainly older people, and so we want to avoid any contact with older folks, and keep social distance, and I guess my personal position is that I am going to do some climbing this summer, but I'm going to go to remote locations and not, interact with really anybody outside of my family, who I've been living with for the past month. And so I think that's a good compromise. I won't be traveling to any ultra crowded crags. I won't be going to Yosemite or any, big spot like that. That's for sure. Okay, moving on here. Question from Max. For strength training on a hangboard, is it better to use slightly bigger holds with extra weight or smaller holds with body weight or even less than body weight? And Max, that's a great question. And it's something that I often talk about to people when I'm coaching on hangboard training. And I think for doing max weight hang training, there's a sweet spot in terms of hold size. I have the Ava Lopez transgression board, one of my boards I train on. I train on a Beastmaker and a number of other boards. And I really like, for max weight hangs, holds that are between about 14 millimeters and 23 millimeters. So that's a pretty solid first pad, maybe half to 3/4 of the first pad of your finger. It's a good size hold that you're not likely to dry fire off of or slip off of. You have enough grip that I can add a lot of weight for two-handed training, or if you're strong, one-handed training. And I just think that's kind of the sweet spot. You don't want to go to a hold so deep that you start to get onto the second joint of your finger, because then you're not training that distal, that DIP flexion, the flexor digitorum profundus muscle in your forearm that runs up and connects to the end of the distal, flexes the distal joint. That's what you really want to be training mostly when you're doing your max weight hangs. And so if you're using a deeper hold, then you're training the FDP and the FDS, the second flexor muscle, which we do want to train. But when you're on small crimps on a climb, it's that flexor digitorum profundus, which is often the limiting constraint. So I would do weighted hangs, half crimp or open crimp on 14 to 23 millimeter edge depth with as much added weight as is appropriate for the training protocol you're using. Now, you should do a small amount of training on smaller holds. And here's why. You need to learn to just mentally and deal with the pain and be used to, this latching on to really tiny little edges. Like the transgression board has an 8 millimeter and a 6 millimeter edge that quite frankly are painful to hang on to. But, to hold on a hold that small, you need some grip, you need some edge, you need some bite into your skin. And part of what you're training is not just the muscles, but also the skin and the fleshy tissue at the tip of your finger, which is called pulp. And we all have a little different anatomy there in terms of the amount of pulp, but training on those small edges, you need to kind of get that tactile sensation of what it's like for the pulp to grip on that crimpy, tiny little painful edge. And so I think everybody, not beginners, but intermediate and advanced climbers, especially if you're an outdoor climber where you have to grab small holds, should do a little bit of training on small edges. A few sets per session or once a week, grab onto some of the small edges with body weight or less. But I think the bulk of your hangboard training should be at body weight or more on a more comfortable moderate edge. Okay, question about, Patrick and Dickie at Café Kraft, do they use energy system concepts? I've not talked in depth with those guys. They're good friends of mine. I've known them for a number of years, and great coaches and really entertaining guys. Patrick's kind of the straight man, the scientist, kind of like me. And then Dickie's more the comedian and movement a guru, and they're both brilliant coaches. And I I believe Patrick's working on a new training book, kind of a follow-up to the Gimme Kraft book, which is a international bestseller, and which, by the way, if you want to pick up a copy of it, we have it on the PhysiVantage website. We are the North American distributors for the Gimme Kraft book. And, the Germans have always been on the forefront of training for climbing. This goes back to Wolfgang Gulick and the coaches he worked with, and together they developed campus training. I've been to Nuremberg and seen and felt the original campus board. It's still there in the Kraft gym in Nuremberg, and so I'm not sure how much they employ energy system concepts in their programming, but I certainly wouldn't doubt anything that they're doing. Those guys are pros, that's for sure. Neil Shepard says coffee's on. Indeed, coffee is on. Okay, a few more questions. Any advice on how to most effectively rest on a red point attempt? From micro shakes to almost freehand stances. Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of route climbing, is learning to rest on a route, and also knowing when you can't stop to rest. How small of a hold you can rest on is a function of your grip strength. Stronger climbers can rest on smaller holds, or you might look at it a different way. Stronger fingers make small holds bigger. And so the hold that, Adam Andra can crimp on and shake out on, I'm probably not going to be shaking out on, because I'm not strong enough. And so we each have to kind of find, what works for us, how we're capable of resting. And yeah, those rests where you can free up your hands with, knee bars, or I look for hand jams as kind of an old trad climber. If I can get a hand jam in a crack or a pocket, that allows you to rest your finger flexors more than if you're hanging on a jug even. And, sometimes the best thing you can do on a route is just climb fast. My strategy that I've been coaching for many years is to climb fast and rest well. So when you get to a good shakeout or a good rest, utilize it. Recover as much as you can. Don't rush out of it. But then when you start climbing, when the holds get small, don't get slower, get faster. And I did a video analysis of Margot Hayes on her ascent of biography, and Adam Andra on his ascent of silence. And they both, though the routes were dramatically different in nature, they were both steep routes that required that they climb very fast through hard moves and then rest extensively at the few shakeouts that were available. And so they unknowingly were employing Eric Hurst's climb fast, rest well strategy. And so that's something that definitely you need to practice in real life situations outside. Greg says, outside climbing right now, just sent my first 512A. Awesome, Greg. That's pretty great. And he says it's been life-changing. And yeah, that is the beauty of climbing, is it has that potential to enrich our lives and perhaps change our lives for the better, and feedback in ways that, the skills you learn through climbing can be leveraged in other areas of your life. Climbing has made me who I am today in terms of the things I'm involved with, and my ability to coach human performance and coach climbing is a result of all the things I've learned over the many years. So Sergio got there first time, age 48. That's cool. Keep climbing, brother. Okay, do we need to train energy systems separately because we need to invest a full session to really improve them, or because one can interfere with the other? Yeah, it's more the latter. Every when you train, it's not the training that makes you stronger. The training is a stimulus that sets in motion a cascade of adaptations through your body that play out in the hours and days after your workout. Most of the signaling on the cellular level occurs in the first few hours, let's say 6 hours after you train. Even in our connective tissues, they found that the loading that turns on the tenocytes gives them the signal to begin to synthesize collagen, to remodel and rebuild your connective tissues, plays out in about a 6-hour period. Now, the after effects of that can take days. Connective tissues can take days to completely recover from loading, from intensive loading. Muscles can take 2 or 3 days to completely recover from a severe workout. But the signaling is set in motion and plays out in the few hours after the workout. So if you are going to do a 2-a-day type training program, you want to be separated by 6 to 8 hours. And those 2 workouts could be different energy systems. We will often do a strength power session in the morning, say at 9 to 11 a.m. in the morning. And then we'll eat lunch, have a nap, do some other things. And then at 5 or 6 in the afternoon, early evening, 5 to 7, 6 to 8 p.m., we do more of an endurance, a power endurance, or sometimes more of an aerobic endurance session, but separated enough that there is less interference between the two. Now, again, when you're doing 2-a-day training, that is more of an elite level strategy. If you do too much of that or too soon as a beginning climber, then there can just be too much breakdown and not enough recovery. And of course, nutrition and rest becomes a big part of the program. But about the worst thing you can do is train all the energy systems together. I call it the shotgun approach, where you go into the gym and you do max bouldering and you do rope climbing and you do max hangs, you do repeaters, you do campusing, you do a little bit of everything. And that's not so effective. And it just kind of overwhelms your body and breaks it down, sets conflicting signals in motion. And I'm not saying it can't work in the short term, that type of training, but in the long term, it's not how you're going to get your best results. Okay. Yeah, so 1 rep max protocol, I think, is good for max hangs, for doing a 7 to 10 second max hang, whether it's a 2-handed weighted hang or a 1-arm hang if you're really strong. But I think with pull-ups, it's better to do 3 to 5 reps. My son Cameron recently posted on his YouTube channel the 5x5 weighted pull-up protocol, which is a really good one for developing maximum strength in your pulling muscles. If you're training 1-arms, sometimes doing an uneven grip pull-up where one hand is on a bar and the other hand's on a helper sling, and you're doing like most of the pulling with 1 arm, and then the helper sling doing a little bit of pulling, doing 3 reps of that on each side, maybe 3 sets of 3 reps is a good way to go. Doing 1-arm lock-offs, hold a lock off for 5 seconds and then lower to a 5-second count. That's a good protocol, a good way to develop 1-arm strength. And so, again, that's something you need to ease into carefully, because there's a lot of things that need to be spun up to get to that point. You need the scapular stabilizer strength. You need, the forearm and pronator strength. And a lot of people that do too much pull-up training or rush into weighted pull-up training end up with elbow issues or shoulder issues. So it's something you want to move into slowly and progress over the course of seasons, not try to ramp up to doing a 1-arm pull-up in a few weeks, which if you're genetically blessed, maybe you'll do that. But for most people, learning to do a 1-arm pull-up is something that takes a few years. Okay, question about aerobic energy system training. Climbing submaximally for up to an hour or two, or doing harder climbing. Yeah, it's tough to just train the aerobic energy system and do it effectively. The whole concept of ARC training, as it's often called, which stands for aerobic recovery circulatory. I think that was first written about in Udo Newman's book and with Dale Goddard um, uh, 25 years ago. And the idea is that when you're gripping on larger holds that are so submaximal, say only 30% of your maximum voluntary contraction, you're not occluding blood flow, and you're not recruiting fast twitch fibers. And so it is a very aerobic, slow twitch oriented type of workout. And so, an arcing session would be where you go and climb very submaximal routes where you're not getting pumped, you're not crimping on small holds, and you go for an hour or two. Now, a couple of things. One, that can be a really boring workout, and it's tough for a lot of people to stick to because you'd like to go to the gym and do something a little harder. And the other thing is that for a more advanced climber, you're not really stressing the system at all. The aerobic system is not getting maximally recruited. You're not getting up to the threshold or the critical force if you're so submaximal, if you're only operating at 30% of maximum voluntary contraction. So while I think for a newer climber, their first year or two in the sport, doing a really long submaximal session once or twice a week could be a great thing, because you're training stamina, the aerobic system, but you're also getting a lot of technical work on the wall. I think for a more advanced climber, there's less to be gained from that. I think of those sessions as being just kind of recovery blood flow sessions, and you're not getting much training value out of them in terms of oxygen kinetics and VO2. To really train up your climbing specific VO2 to take it up to the next level, you need to be operating right near the aerobic threshold or the anaerobic aerobic threshold, which is tougher to identify in terms of finger force. It could be, between 40 and 70% of your maximum voluntary contraction, where you begin to occlude blood flow and you begin to go anaerobic. Ultimately, in that middle zone, both energy systems, anaerobic lactic and the aerobic energy system, are contributing to ATP production. And that's the mode you want to be in to develop your aerobic system maximally for a high VO2, where both energy systems are contributing, but the aerobic system is actually consuming the lactate. The slow twitch fibers are actually utilizing the lactate that is a metabolic byproduct of the anaerobic lactic energy system. And so when you're training it right around the threshold, the beauty of it is you are fully recruiting the slow twitch fibers. So you're consuming as much oxygen as you can. You're just going anaerobic enough to get your lactate values up a bit, but they're not escalating. You're not getting acidic. The aerobic system is able to consume lactate, which, by the way, circulates systemically through your body. So fibers throughout your body, in your legs and elsewhere, even your brain can use lactate for energy. And as long as you're consuming lactate at the same rate the fast twitch fibers are generating lactate from anaerobic glycolysis, they are negating each other, and you'll have an elevated lactate, but it won't skyrocket. It'll be elevated between 2 and 4 if you were testing a lactate value. And right in that zone is where you want to train the aerobic energy system to be maximally effective. So kind of the bottom line is doing submaximal climbing, but not so submaximal that it's easy. Climbing, let's say 2 number grades below your limit for a half an hour. So you're not getting on any routes that you would fall off of. at a gym or at a crag. You may occasionally crimp down on a hard move, but as long as you're getting off of it quickly and blood flow resumes, you're probably going to be fine. In terms of perceived exertion, a 7 or 8 out of 10. Your pump should similarly be moderate, but not extreme. You shouldn't get that acidy, form exploding sensation. That's a sign that you're deeply anaerobic, and that you're no longer, in that threshold zone that you want to be in. And so that is a tough thing to explain to a climber, certainly through the internet. I can work with somebody in person. I can even put a muscle oxygen sensor on your forearm and work with you to help you identify the level of exertion and the amount of pump that keeps you oxygenated, and helps you identify what the feeling is of being at that aerobic threshold. And that's kind of the zone you want to be at. And by the way, when you do 4x4 bouldering, if you're not doing routes that are so hard that you're falling off, that can be a pretty good way to train VO2 max, because you will be operating in that threshold zone. During your short rest between boulders, you'll be consuming and uptaking lactate that was generated from anaerobic glycolysis when you're bouldering. And so if it's not maximal exertion on those bouldering 4x4s, that can be a pretty good way to do training of the aerobic energy system. But again, that's one of the toughest things to get across to people, and to help them get right, especially if you're not working with them in person. Okay. Great training cafe. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, we have a Treadwall. It's the core made by Treadwall. There's a few different companies out there that make them, but I think Brewer's Ledge, if you're in North America, Brewer's Ledge makes the Treadwall, a few different models. That's the one you want to look into and get. I'm not sure the Treadwalls in Europe, who they're made by. Getting back into climbing after a long period off, I think the first thing you want to do is just, kind of find your feet, learn to get your climbing skill and movement skill back, not dive right back into training at the level that you remember doing back in the day, and give yourself a few months to kind of refine your skills, and not dust off the hangboard and go back all in on a hangboard program. I think you need to give yourself a transition period where you climb frequently, maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and also do a little bit of supplemental training. The good thing is that climbing skill, kind of like riding a bike, will come back quickly to you. You don't lose it after you have it. The fine-tuned skill you lose, and that needs to be regained. But, just kind of your intuitive movement skills, if they've been earned in previous years, will come back to you pretty quickly. Yeah, BFR is a useful training tool, and especially as a protocol during rehab, during injury. It can help maintain strength during time away from climbing due to injury. It can actually potentially help speed healing of certain injuries. And even for a healthy climber, it may be of some use, though it's not a replacement. It's not a game changer in those settings. But I think it is a game changer when applied to injured climbers. I did a training cafe on this a few weeks ago, so check it out. I've also done a podcast on it with Tyler Nelson, who's one of the more knowledgeable people in the climbing world on utilizing BFR. And where am I at here in time-wise? Holy smokes, I've gone long, much longer than I had intended. So maybe I'll just wrap it up there. If you typed in a question and I see a few of them there, then I'll try to get to you in the next episode. And oh, look at that. Shout out from my own son, Cameron Hurst. Yes, Cam, I did mention your YouTube channel. Hey, listeners, if you like training videos, go to YouTube and search Cameron Hurst and find his channel and subscribe to it. So there you go. You got 2 for the price of 1, Cam. And so next week here in the United States, Monday is Memorial Day. So I don't think I'll do a training cafe because I imagine a lot of people might be out and about doing stuff. And so maybe next week it'll be Tuesday and Thursday or Tuesday and Friday for Training Cafe. And then as we get into June and July, I am going to go to some remote area out west to do a little bit of climbing, but more on that later on. So I guess it's time to sign off today's Training Cafe with a sip of coffee. Everyone, thanks again for joining me. Thanks for the feedback, and I apologize if I did not get to your training question today, but there's always next time at the Training Cafe. Hurst out.